All stand, please. Please be seated.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Your Honour. It's a big moment, Your Honour. I've just heard that Mr McDonald's family have worked out how to get the YouTube link up onto the big screen television. So,
Who have?
Mr McDonald's family, Your Honour.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I noticed there's over 3,000 views by lunchtime
I
today.
think we're doing quite well, Your Honour. I think some of those views are not related to Mr Ioannidis. But I can't vouch for the fact that the rest of them are not related to Mr Temponi.
I suspect none of them are related to Mr. Reid.
Okay, Your Honour. Now, Mr Gilmore, before lunch we were discussing the area of the big log. Before I return to that topic, is Mr Crowe still one of the principals of burning issues?
Yes, it's correct.
Where's Mr Crowe today? Do you know?
Where is he today? At home, I imagine.
Right, thank you. Now, we were discussing some of the lay evidence that His Honour has heard regarding the early observations of the location and path of the fire. Could I ask Mr Temponi please to bring up next on the court screen document 52. And just pause there. Mr Gilmore, had you been provided with either the video or the transcript of Ms Barrett's interview with the Tasmanian Police from the 5th of January 2013?
Yes, I have.
Right. And so could we go in this document, please, to page 89? It's just more convenient, Mr Gilmore, than taking you to the video.
Thank you.
And could I ask you to read from about line 15 down to the bottom of the page.
Thank you.
Now, Mr Gilmore, if you've either seen the video or read the rest of this transcript, you'll have observed that Ms Barrett told the police about the first few minutes after she first saw flames on the property. She was running back and forth to the tap, filling buckets of water and trying to fight the fire. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And she was running back and forth between, among other places, the side of the house where the tap is and the general area of the tree stump. Do you understand that to be the case?
My understanding is that she was working down along the edge in between the two driveways.
Okay.
And running up and down. I think she met the first crew at the bottom of the driveway there somewhere.
All right. Well, can we please, Mr Temponi, bring up document 101 and go to photograph 63 in that bundle. Now, you referred to the Ms Barrett meeting the fireys at the bottom of one driveway. His Honour's heard evidence that's the driveway that curves around to the left.
Oh, yes.
Now, do I understand you to be saying that it was your understanding from Ms Barrett's evidence that she was running back and forth from the house to about where on this photograph?
My understanding is that the area, I was thinking of pointing there, the area where the driveway curls around to the left, where that first tree is on the left,
right.
That area through there. My understanding was the fire was both sides of the other driveway, and she was working in that area.
Okay, and when you say the other driveway, do you mean the one that's slightly to the right of where the...
Yes, the one that's virtually straight on. I think it's referred to as the gentle sloping or those sorts of words, and the other one's called the rocky or the steep, depending on...
Okay, now,
what.
Just for completeness, Mr Gilmore, do you see that to the right of the tree stump there are two pale lines, which I can tell you in fact are vehicle tracks, and that's a third driveway. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, it looked to me like that had been bulldozed a few years earlier.
Okay, and Ms. Barrett gave evidence, and perhaps Mr. Temponi could bring up court book page 168. Sorry, court book document 168. Ms. Barrett gave evidence that in the very, very early stages of the fire, the line or low wall of flames that was referred to in her statement to the police was between points A and B on that photograph, or between the driveways indicated by A and B on that photograph, and then slightly to the right of driveway B. Do you understand?
Yep.
Now, if we can go back to the previous photograph, please, Mr. Temponi. Would you agree with me, Mr. Gilmore, that if Miss Barrett was running between the house and the tree on the curving steep driveway that you indicated before, then on each return trip to the house, she would have been looking in the pretty much directly at the area of the big log?
I can't imagine her focusing in that direction. I think my experience is people will be looking where the majority of the fire area is.
Well, this is not expert evidence.
Please,
Mr. Armstrong.
Now, I showed you Ms. Barrett's transcript, Mr. Gilmore, and you saw that she told the police that she was 100% certain that the fire had started at the tree stump. Do you recall that?
Yes, I see that, yep.
Now, I've taken you so far, Mr. Gilmore, to Ms. Barrett's evidence, Mr. Robinson's evidence, and Mr. Butler's evidence, none of whom raise any suggestion that the fire was in the area of the big log, either side of the big log, or in the area of the septic line, until after the fire had otherwise commenced and was starting to then move around, backing in the wind. In light of that evidence, Mr. Gilmore, would you accept that your conclusion that the area around the big log and the septic line is unlikely, or in fact could not have been, the area of origin of the fire?
The movement of fire out of that area is the thing that's led us to a different area of origin to the Tasmanian Fire Service report.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go to the expert evidence. I beg your pardon. The Tasmanian Fire Service evidence then, Mr. Gilmore. Could Mr. Temponi please bring up on the transcript page 235, which is Mr. Walkley's evidence on the 3rd of May. Page 235, Mr. Temponi, thank you. And could we go down to line 33? Or in fact, perhaps zoom back out and can we show lines 15 down to the bottom of the page? Now, please read that to yourself, Mr. Gilmore, and let me know when you've finished.
Thank you. Yes, finish that, thanks.
Now, you understand from that evidence, Mr. Gilmore, that the assessment of Mr. Walkley was that although that area around the big log had burned, in fact it had burned later on once the fire had done something like a big loop and had run back as a running fire across that area, having come up from the gully to the south of the house.
Yes, I see that.
And you would agree that that's a perfectly plausible explanation for the fire direction indicators that you identified when you had a look at the site some years later.
The only thing is there is an area just above the septic lines that moves towards the septic lines, and the septic lines did not burn. So the movement is from an area south of the log between there and the septic lines initially.
Right, and do you
northeast.
Draw that conclusion, Mr. Gilmore, from your own examination of the area in 2018 or from photographs?
From both, yes.
All right. And putting that together, well, firstly, in relation to Mr. Walkley's conclusion that's shown on the page here, do you agree with Mr. Walkley that that's the explanation for, a plausible explanation for most of the fire direction indicators that you were able to identify in that area to the south of the big log?
Using just my examination or the photos?
All of the information that you've
All
got.
of the information, yeah. No, the photos clearly show the area of the septic lines is unburnt, and then an area just to the north of that moved towards the septic lines, and then an area further to the north moved out across the road. So that's what the indicators show.
And that area further to the north, when you say it moved out towards the road, do you mean it came up from the gully to the area north of the big log and then across to the nearest of the three driveways?
Initially the movement was to the east and then to the northeast, across that third bulldozed driveway that we discussed earlier.
To the east from what starting point? To where the fire that you're just describing, from what direction had it approached the big log?
There's no evidence of it approaching into that area, so it radiates out in all directions.
So do you disagree with Mr. Walkley that he was able to assess that the fire had come up from the gully as a free burning fire and then had trickled across the grass into that area?
Yes, I disagree.
Right. So
Sorry.
4 years, when you examined the location 5 years after the event, were you able to make that assessment from the physical indicators?
No, not.
Right.
I wouldn't have known the septic area was unburnt from my examination at that time.
Okay, well, when you went there 5 years after the event, Mr. Gilmore, were there any physical indicators still present in that area of the big log and the septic line that enabled you to make an independent assessment as to the direction of fire travel when a fire had hit that area 5 years before?
Yes.
Right,
Yes,
and what were they?
So they were consistent with the
What
photos.
were the indicators, Mr. Gilmore?
The main were stains and the effects on rocks that were buried in the ground.
Right,
That's
so
the main thing that we looked at.
All that was left by the time you got there was some soot on rocks.
There was staining on rocks, yes.
Okay, staining. What's staining the rocks?
Staining happens when they...
I didn't ask how it happens, I asked what it is. It's soot, isn't it?
What it is, it's deposits of carbon and moisture. It almost varnishes on the rocks.
Right, and is that what most people would call soot, Mr. Gilmore?
No, I wouldn't think so.
Right.
I'd imagine soot is drier in
Okay.
nature.
All right, so the only indicators when you went there were the staining on the rocks, and then beyond that, the only information you had about the direction of fire travel was the photographs that had been made available to you.
There were some remaining scars on stumps and things in the area as well.
All right, and I put it to you, Mr. Gilmore, that the scars on stumps indicated at different locations fires burning in different directions.
Yes.
Right, and the staining on the rocks indicated fires burning in different directions.
Yes.
And so far as there were fire indicators in that area, there were fire indicators that were entirely consistent with the explanation that Mr. Walkley offered.
If the area below that had been burnt, yes, but it wasn't.
Well, when you say below it, you mean the gully to the south of it?
No, where the septic lines are.
Well, the septic lines are between the big log and the gully to the south of the house, Mr. Gilmore. Do you understand that?
Yes.
So I'm still struggling to understand. You're saying that are you disagreeing with Mr. Walkley that the fire came up from the gully into that area?
No, the fire came up and hit the area of no fuel where the septic lines had recently been installed, and no further movement up the hill from there, from that fire.
Right. Okay. And then to the area north of the cleared septic space,
yes,
and up to the big log, you say that had burned from from east to west, not west to east.
Yes, so if we imagine it as my hand, and that's the area we're talking about the centre of my palm, it moves to the east and then the northeast.
Well, let's do this by reference to photograph 63 in document 101. And if Mr. Temponi could take a screenshot, please. Thank you. Now, bear with me, Mr. Gilmore. Mr. Temponi, could you put the cursor on the big log? Thank you. Now, to the right of of the big log, Mr. Temponi, there's an area of grey material. Could I ask you to circle that? That's it. Thank you. Now, is that the area that you're describing as north of the cleared septic area, Mr. Gilmore?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Temponi, could you mark that with an A? Now, to the right of the cleared area where the septic is, Mr. Temponi, could you prepare another area that curves around the edge towards the bottom of the screen from that cleared area? So start there, come down towards the bottom of the screen, not so far, up to the up to about there. Now, from the bottom of that line, go towards the right of the screen, and then curve it around to run parallel to the edge of the cleared area of the septic. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Stop there, and then curve it around back to the start of that line, and from the top of that line, join those 2 points, please. And we'll mark that B. Now, to be clear, Mr. Gilmore, are you saying that area B was burned by a fire moving from west to east, but area A was burned by a fire moving from east to west?
No. Area B wasn't burned.
Right.
And area A, part of that was burned.
Okay. What's the area that you said was burned by the fire moving up from the gully?
If you went to the right of the bottom of B, so if we went down into the burnt area there was some indication there that fire had come up from the gully, and further down the gully, the fire had travelled down the gully.
All right. Can you circle that general area, please, Mr. Temponi, and we'll call that C. So to be clear, Mr. Gilmore, you say that some of area A was burned from east to west, area B was not burned, and area C was burned from west to east.
Part of area A was burnt, and it's burnt in almost every direction of the compass from about the centre of A, so radiated out, if that makes sense. Area B is part of an unburnt area where the recent disturbance of the septic lines had been in. And area C, the majority of that would have burnt coming up the gully.
All right. Now,
Armstrong, can I interrupt you? Please, do you have the facility to see the transcript in front of you, otherwise than through the court?
No, I don't think I do, Your Honour. Sorry, unless Mr. Cox is able to show it to me.
Yes, I think it's important if you wouldn't mind taking a minute.
Certainly.
To navigate to...
I do have a hard copy if Your Honour's referring to previous days.
Oh, yes, I am.
Yes.
If you could navigate to yourself to page 637. About line 17. No, I'm sorry. I've misled you. Yes, page 637.
Yes.
Yes, from about line 17.
Certainly.
Sorry, line 35.
Yes.
To the bottom of the page.
Yes.
At some stage, I want to be informed about that, but I don't want to interrupt your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honour. No, not at all, Your Honour. Your Honour's leave, I'll come to it in just 1 second. Now, Mr. Gilmore, you've just described areas A and area B. Now, area C, you would agree with me, is what you would call forest, yes?
Yes.
And trees together with thick undergrowth.
Yes. Yep.
Right. And you would assume that it had been thick undergrowth back in January 2013 before the fire.
Yes.
Right. And you would not by any means call area C a grassy area, would you?
No.
Now, if we could go back, please, Mr. Temponi, to transcript page 235. That was Mr. Walkley's evidence. I'm just trying to get a bit of clarity here, Mr. Gilmore.
Yes.
We can go back to that area about line 35.
Mm-hmm.
See that Mr. Gilmore's conclusion is that the fire in this area has come up from the gully from a free burning fire and has trickled across the grass into that area. It had not gone the other way around. So would you agree with me that Mr. Walkley there is describing the grassy area around the big log?
I'm sorry, I got lost in the lines there, sir. It was line 20...
Line 35.
35, where I thought I was looking, yes. Oh, yes. Yep. I see that now.
Now, Mr. Walkley there is talking about a grassy area, so
Yes.
it's fairly clear that's not going to be area C, isn't it?
Yes, my assumption is he's talking about area A.
Yes.
Um,
And so,
when he's talking
can I
about...
ask you again, Mr. Gilmore, are you telling His Honour that you disagree with Mr. Walkley's assessment?
Yes.
All right. Now, next, could Mr. Temponi please bring up the transcript of the 11th of May? And could we go to page 637? And Mr. Gilmore, could you read from lines 10 down to the bottom of the page?
Okay.
And please let me know when you're ready.
finished, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Templini, could you now please bring up Court Book 192? And now, having read that transcript, Mr. Gilmore, and seeing again Mr. Robinson's map, you would understand that Mr. Robinson is saying that the fire comes back and it does in fact start to damage the plastic pipes of the sewage line, and he indicated that it was the pipes nearest the tips of the arrows in yellow on that photograph, and that happened late in the afternoon of the 3rd of January.
Yes, before the second truck got there, I think.
Well, don't worry about the numbers of trucks, Mr. Gilmore, because there were a lot of them.
Yeah, and the damage to the pipe is also visible in the photos. And so if you went to the right-hand arrow and moved diagonally to the bottom left from that arrow, there is a in the clear area there is a line and a blob on the edge of the burnt area. That's about where that burnt plastic pipe is.
All right, yes, we understand that, Mr. Gilmore, but the point is that Mr. Robinson's evidence is that the fire came back to that area later in the afternoon of the 3rd of January. You understand that that was what Mr. Robinson was saying, don't you?
Yes.
And again, I need to ask you, Mr. Gilmore, does that change your assessment that, in fact, the fire that came across this area, travelling in any direction, was a fire that had come from somewhere else and then burned across this area between the big log and the far side of the cleared area of the septic system?
I think it's consistent with the backing fire moving in the direction of the right-hand arrow.
Right, and it's also consistent with the backing fire moving in the direction, consistent with a fire moving in the direction of the left-hand yellow arrow, isn't it?
Yeah, but the indicators don't show the movement in that direction.
All right, and Mr. Walkley says that the fire burned across that grassy area later in the day as a result of having swung all the way around under the influence of wind and then coming up from the gully across that area. Now, I put it to you, Mr. Gilmore, that when you combine Mr. Robinson's evidence and Mr. Walkley's evidence, all of the fire indicators that you point to in that area of this big log and the septic system are all explained by Mr. Robinson's account of where he understood the fire was moving, his impressions, if I use the language before lunch, and all explained by Mr. Walkley's evidence.
The problem there is the height of scorch in the area of the two arrows. So if a fire had come from the gully, if you look in the bottom right of the photo, you can see more intense fire in mature trees, and I believe you've had described scorch. So flame height will scorch the leaves above it, and the trees there are generally shorter in that area, so you would expect scorch to be more prominent in those areas because it's a product of flame height, as was described. So the flame height in that area is quite low through that forest, which is not what you would expect if the fire had run up from the gully into that area.
Well,
so the explanation for that is that the backing fire had got to around about the area of the big black tree, and the area further to the right where it ran up the gully shows some effect of scorch.
Well, and the fire that came back to the area indicated by the red box with the green arrow in it, during the afternoon of the 3rd of January would have constituted backing fire as well, wouldn't it?
The bottom part of that box, yes.
And that would explain, when you say the bottom part of that box, do you mean towards the bottom of the photograph or the...
No, the bottom part of that box. So perhaps the bottom fifth of the box, something like that, exhibits backing fire.
Right. And what about the other 2/3 of the box?
Well, there is fire moves from the middle bottom of the box above that line I just outlined, so about a fifth of the way up, and then it moves out through the top left-hand corner of the box, and then there's movement of fire on the top right-hand corner of the box going that way,
When
or
you say that
south
way.
or down the gully.
When you say that way, do you mean southeast?
Yes, south-southeast, yes. There are several indicators there.
Okay, so you can identify, Mr. Gilmore, that within the area indicated by the box, at some point fire has burned in different directions.
Yes.
And the fire coming back in the direction of the left-hand yellow arrow during the afternoon of the 3rd of January would have been backing fire, agreed?
No, that crosses through that area where it ran out and then moved to the north.
Sorry, please listen to my question, Mr. Gilmore. A fire during the afternoon of the 3rd of January in the area of the left-hand yellow arrow would have been, by definition, a backing fire because the wind was blowing towards the east. It would have been a fire burning back into the wind, wouldn't it?
Yes, if that's where the fire was, yes.
Yes, okay. And a fire coming up from the gully and trickling across that area in the way that Mr. Walkley concluded would also have been a trickling fire of relatively low intensity, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Right. And so backing fire coming into the wind, according to Mr. Robinson, or running fire but trickling up from the gully, as described by Mr. Walkley, would in each case have been fire of relatively low intensity and relatively low flame height. Agreed?
Yes, agreed.
And accordingly, those two explanations for fire entering into the red box area at different times are a perfectly coherent explanation for the fire language that you observed.
No, because the top right of the box is heading the wrong direction for that scenario.
Right, you say the top right of the box is moving back towards the southeast.
Yes, south-southeast, yes.
Now, are you aware, Mr. Gilmore, that Mr. Bones reached the same conclusion about about the circumstances in which that area came to be burned as Mr. Walkley had reached?
No, I wasn't aware of that, sir.
All right. Well, in fairness to you, can Mr. Temponi please bring up transcript, the transcript of the 4th of May? And can we go to page 298? Had you been provided with the transcript of Mr. Bones' evidence to his honour, Mr. Gilmore?
Yes, I have, but I haven't read this bit.
All right, so could we go to the bottom of page 298? And firstly, could you read that paragraph starting at about line 35?
Okay. Yeah, finish that, thank you.
All right. And then, Mr. Temponi, could you please take us to page 300? And on this page, Mr. Gilmore, could you read from line 15 down to the bottom of the page?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Now, figures 5 and 20 that Mr. Bones is referring to there are from your second report, that is the August 2020 report, Mr. Gilmore. If we could go to document 15 so that you can refresh your memory.
Thank you.
And start with corporate page 0254. Thank you, Mr. Temponi. In fact, I think Mr. Reid showed you this morning an annotated version of this photograph.
Right. Yes, I've seen that before, certainly.
You have, yes.
Yeah.
Now you understand then, Mr. Gilmore, that Mr. Bones's assessment from his examination of the scene back in on the 6th and 7th of January 2013 was that the fire that had run across this area had run from east to west.
Right.
Now, again, Mr. Gilmore, do you disagree with Mr. Bones's assessment?
Yes, I do disagree. Yes.
All right. Are you aware, Mr. Gilmore, that when Mr. Thomas, I'll withdraw that, I'll start again. Are you aware that when Mr. Thomas examined the property at 242 White Hills Road, he was not able to identify an area of origin?
I think I have in my mind something about him saying a complex scene or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Thomas had examined the scene in late 2013. You understand that?
Yes.
And you say that you're better able to make an assessment of this complex fire scene for the purposes of determining direction of fire travel than Mr. Thomas was some 5 years before you.
Using the photos, yes.
Right, okay. And you've agreed with me several times today that photos are generally a pretty limited resource when it comes to trying to understand things like the micro indicators that are important for assessing direction of fire travel, aren't they?
I certainly agree with Mr. Bones's statement about multiple angles, and as I said earlier, we're lucky we've got photos from various angles which do assist you and help give you more than one dimension, because it is just a flat two-dimensional thing. And so there are a couple of things in that you took me through that, in particular, the white ash demonstrates, in this photo, for instance, quite considerable amounts of burning. So you can actually see where logs have been laying on the ground by the white ash that's left there, and you can even see the shapes of sticks and things. So that represents a larger piece of fuel is burnt. You can also see a common phenomenon which can be a trap, and that's where sticks and logs cross or have fuel radiated, radiated back onto them. So the stick in the foreground, for instance, has a larger piece of wood to the right-hand side, which is radiated to heat. You can see that effect. And then further up, you can see where a stick has been laying across a log, and that has burnt more, and the stick actually goes out when it moves away from that radiated area. So it does demonstrate a few things there.
All right. Now, in terms of the staining that we see on the rocks there, Mr. Gilmore, there's one of two potential explanations. Sorry, I'll put it to you that there's two potential explanations for staining like that. The first is that it is a record of the direction in which smoke and therefore flames were travelling, in the sense that flames being blown toward the rock will likewise cause the discharge of charcoal against the rock that they're approaching, and therefore the staining appears on the side of the rock from which the fire approached.
As the flame wraps around, yes.
Right. And the other explanation for the other plausible potential explanation for staining on rocks is that in fact that's a location where there was available fuel. It was protected from the prevailing winds by the mass of the rock, and therefore it was able to burn against the rock for longer, and that's why it left the staining.
It could be if you had, particularly those areas we pointed out, with the deeper white ash there, yep, representing longer burning. Yes.
Okay, and so you can't tell by looking at these photographs whether the stains here were caused by the first phenomenon, that is indicating the direction from which the fire had come, or caused by the second phenomenon, namely showing the lee side of the rocks as the wind was blowing across them.
The effect, though, for lee side is that all of the fuel doesn't consume, is normally what happens. And if it was a heavier, like a jackpot of fuel or some term like that, then the great amounts of white ash would show. So, such as the rocks in the middle of the photo, if you go up to the right towards that log, there's a large white area there where a big log is burnt. The same further up to the right along the edge of the bulldozed pile there. You can see where logs have been, and there's quite big amounts of ash and charcoal still there.
Well, firstly, if Mr. Temponi could take the cursor up to the left-hand side of the screen, just below the water tank. Actually, no, that's perfect, thank you. That scar of white ash there would be consistent with prolonged burning of a jackpot of fuel on the lee side of a rock, wouldn't it?
I can't tell, sir, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Now, it is sloping though, so it...
Yes, but it's perfectly consistent with the second phenomenon of staining on rocks. It could be on the lee side.
With that slope, yes, I'd be happy with that.
And then you referred to a scar of white ash near where a pile had been bulldozed. Could
Yes.
Mr. Temponi move the cursor directly to the right, please, to the far side of the next two rocks? Stop. No, back a bit more. That's it. Stop. Is that the scar of white ash you're referring to?
Yes, there's that diagonal one there. Yes, that's one.
And do you say, Mr. Gilmore, that you think that that would have been a significant log that has completely incinerated down to white powder?
Yeah, there's some small black bits in it, but the majority of it is burnt, yes.
Right, but it could be explained by other types of fuel, couldn't it?
I'm not sure what you mean, sir, in that environment. So,
Well, it could have been smaller branches, piled up bits of small branch and leaves.
Well, it could be in that shape, perhaps, if it was like a bundle of sticks or something.
All right. And so those are the 2 lines of ash, 2 points of ash that you've referred to. And beyond that, working within the limitations of a 2-dimensional photograph, when that's really the only information you've got as to what this scene looked like at the time, the staining on these rocks doesn't really give you any reliable indicator as to the direction of fire travel, even within the areas shown in this photograph, do they?
In this photograph, that's correct, yeah.
Right. Well, can we go to figure 20 in the same report? It's virtually the same photograph, but... And again, Mr. Gilmore, when you look at the various things that are depicted in this photograph, there are a couple of patches of white ash. At least one of them to the right of the photograph seems to be well away from any kind of rock, boulder. And beyond that, there's nothing in this photograph that enables you confidently to identify the direction of fire travel at any particular location through this area, is there?
No, not in this photograph. No, it has some conflicting things in it.
All right. Now, Mr. Gilmore, I've taken you through Mr. Butler's evidence, who said that there was no burning in this area, otherwise they would have put hoses on it.
Well, I object, Your Honour. That's not the evidence. It's the area between the stump and the big log the hose is referred to, not this area.
No, that's not correct, I don't think. I looked at this at lunchtime. Was it 3:57?
Yeah, it was 157, Your Honour. I think it was 157, I think, Your Honour.
Yeah, 157. area to the right of the tree stump and the left of the grey log.
Now, Your Honour...
Just a moment.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Temponi. Your Honour, I accept the correction in relation to 157.
Yes, I just want to see what photograph was being referred to. Which means I need to scroll back.
It was, I think, document 101, photograph 58, Your Honour.
Yes, I see it. It's on page 154. It's
Yes.
referred to. If we could just see that, please. Could we just zoom in on that, please? Yes, to the right of the tree stump and to the left
Yes.
of the grey log. What's the evidence?
Yes, Your Honour. So that's the area between, on this photograph, it's the area between the old stump and the grey log. That was the topic that was addressed at page 157.
Mm-hmm.
But at page 154, Mr. Butler had been asked about the area on either side of the log.
Yep.
And he said that he had not observed anything in terms of signs of fire having passed over that area already.
And in cross-examination, he said there was no need to go down there.
I think that's right, Your Honour.
Yes.
Yes. So, Mr. Gilmore, you've heard that Mr. Butler, who was one of the first fireys on the scene, reported seeing no signs of that area, if you'll forgive me, around the big log, having
Yes.
been burned by the time he got there.
Mm-hmm.
And you've seen Mr. Robinson's evidence that fire came back into that area later in the afternoon. And you've seen Mr. Walkley's and Mr. Bones's conclusions based on their examinations on the 6th and 7th of January 2013, that although fire had reached into that area, it had either been a backing fire or a fire that had come up from the gully later in the course of the fire. Now, I put it to you, Mr. Gilmore, that in light of all of that evidence, the explanation for the burning, signs of burning that you see in the photographs that were provided to you and that you saw on the rocks when you attended the site is most probably explained by the kinds of later events in the course of the fire that were identified by Mr. Walkley and Mr. Bones.
I don't think so, sir. It's not my opinion.
Okay, and I put it to you, Mr. Gilmore, that it follows as well that that area around the big log, more probably than not, was not part of the area of origin of the fire.
Well, again, sir, the area around the log is unburnt, the majority of it. So the southeastern corner of the log, the area adjacent to it there is burnt. You can see the dark circle.
Mr. Gilmore, you understand the question, don't you? Do we have to do this the slow way? You understand that I'm putting to you that the area around the big log that was shown, for instance, in your figures 5 and figure 20 was only burned later in the course of the fire.
No, I don't think that.
Right. And the basis for your conclusion to the contrary of Mr. Bones and Mr. Walkley is your examination of rocks with some staining on them and your examination of the photographs from January 2013 that were provided to you.
And the burn and char patterns that are evident, for instance, in this photo, and witness statements talking, there is reference from some people about that large black tree near the septic, and I'm assuming that's the one in the photo there. It's the one that stands out.
Right. Are you
And that's
referring, Mr. Gilmore, to the evidence of the berries?
No.
Right. Can you tell me whose evidence you're referring to?
I think it's Mr. Butler, from when they arrived and where the fire was. I think Mr. Robinson also.
Well, I've taken you to Mr. Butler's and Mr. Robinson's evidence to his honour,
Yes.
Mr. Gilmore, and both of them, I think you would agree with me, have given evidence that is to the effect that the area shown in figures 5 and 20 of your photographs that you identify as being part of the area of origin is an area that was only burned once the fire was underway.
No, I don't think that.
You don't think that that's the evidence, or you don't agree with it?
I don't think that's what occurred. The burn and char patterns.
Well, you're probably arguing your case through the witness now, Mr. Armstrong. I think you've fulfilled your footage obligations. It's for me to decide.
Your Honour, we're pleased to know that that was in fact my last question on the topic.
I wasn't trying to hurry you along. I was just making the observation that they're the sorts of things that I expect to hear in closing submissions.
If it please.
Yes, thanks.
Now, Mr. Gilmore, can we now turn to your second report, that is the 2020 report?
Mm-hmm.
And the observations that you made in the course of your attendance at the site and the excavations that were the subject of your first report were also the principal basis for your conclusions in the second report, weren't they?
About that, yes.
Okay. Now, if Mr. Temponi could please just take us within Court Book Document 15 to paragraph 107 on page 0258. You refer in paragraph 107, Mr. Gilmore, to a report that you appear to have been provided from an observer in the McGregor Fire Tower near Eagle Hawk Neck.
Mm-hmm.
And could I just trouble you to read paragraph 107 to yourself?
Yep.
And
Yes.
I take it that your purpose in mentioning that evidence, Mr. Gilmore, was to identify another vector, as it were, that indicates that the fire that started in the Fawcett area on the 3rd of January 2013 started somewhere to the west of the house at 244 White Hills Road.
Yeah, and time-stamped as well.
Right, okay. And Mr. Gilmore, if there had been, I beg your pardon, I'll withdraw that, the conclusion that you reach in your second report is that the fire that is described as the Fawcett bushfire started in the area that you identify as the area of origin on the property at 242 White Hills Road, correct?
Yes.
Right. And given your knowledge or your understanding that there were fire spotters in fire towers, at least down near Eagle Hawk Neck, if there had been another fire that started in the Fawcett area in fairly heavily forested country, half an hour or so before the fire that started on 242 White Hills Road, you would have expected there to be reports of that as well, wouldn't you?
There could be, although there is quite some delay, and that's normally the reason for fire towers, is that fires in remoter areas don't get the same passing traffic as a grass fire on the side of the Arthur Highway, for instance. And so there is a delay, the fires are now able to get bigger. So that is the main reason that fire lookout observers are employed around Australia.
And so if there had been another fire that started half an hour before the 242 White Hills Road fire, then you would have expected the fire spotters covering that area to have picked it up pretty smartly, wouldn't you?
I would expect within 20 minutes, perhaps, something like that.
Thank you.
Would be something we'd work on.
Now, surely, Mr. Gilmore, on a day with the weather conditions like the 3rd of January 2013, a fire starting in forested country in somewhere like Fawcett was going to get picked up by a fire spotter an awful lot sooner than 20 minutes in.
I think, sir, that the issue may be on a day like that is the visibility. So
Mr. Gilmore, what we see here is that you've placed some reliance on a report from a fire spotter. I think we can assume that visibility was pretty good, wasn't it?
Later in the day, certainly it was.
Well, Mr. Gilmore, at 14:24, the visibility was good enough that somebody at Eaglehawk Neck could report the fire somewhere just to the west of the house at 244 White Hills Road.
Yes, on a bearing of 312.
Now, is there anything in the evidence, Mr. Gilmore, that suggests to you that visibility changed in any material way between 1:30 and 2:30 on the 3rd of January 2013?
No, it was later in the day.
Right, thank you. Now, if a fire had started somewhere in the area of 244 White Hills Road or Inala Road at any time between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock on the 3rd of January 2013, you would have expected a fire spotter to pick it up inside 5 minutes, surely.
No, not surely, no.
Right, 10 minutes?
Depends what fuel it's burning in. So.
Heavy forest, we've established that, Mr. Gilmore. You understood my question was about a fire starting in heavy forest at about 1:30.
Depends on whereabouts in the landscape, how wet, and when the smoke appears over the ranges.
Mr. Gilmore, are you suggesting that there was a thunderstorm on the morning of the 3rd of January?
No, just...
There was nothing to indicate to you that that forest was going to be wet, is there?
No, not...
No, we're talking about effectively the same conditions as existed at 2:15. I'm just asking you to assume that a fire started in heavy forest within a couple of 100 metres of that spot on that day in those wind conditions in heavy forest. It was going to be dry, wasn't it?
Yes.
And it's heavy forest.
Yes.
Fire is going to take off quickly.
It could.
It's going to send up a lot of smoke very quickly.
It could, yes.
Fire spotters are monitoring that area.
Yes.
Fire spotters will be constantly scanning everything that they can see 360 degrees from their fire tower, aren't they?
That is their role, yes.
Constantly. Constantly. Would you agree?
No, sir.
Right. On a total fire ban day, what do you suggest the fire spotters would have been doing?
I have supervised fire lookout observers in the past, and people can get fixated, so we actually encourage them to do their duties, keep logs, do radio calls, and then scan, and then do the same thing and then scan. Right. So it is possible for a fire to exist for a little while before the fire lookout observer sees it, but it's generally still before the public sees it.
All right. Well, put to one side possibilities, Mr. Gilmore, would you agree with me that as a matter of probability, in the conditions that you know to have existed in southeastern Tasmania on the afternoon of the 3rd of January 2013, a fire spotter with visibility across to the Fawcett area was very likely to see within a single number of minutes a fire that ignites in heavy, dry forest?
Yes, I'll accept that, sir.
Now, in your 2020 report, can we next go, please, to paragraph 125? And could you read that, please, to yourself? Let me know when you're ready.
Yes.
Now, you refer there to Mr. Thomas's reports, and footnote 51 is a reference to Mr. Thomas's first two reports of the 17th of December 2018 and the 10th of July 2020. Do you see that?
Yes, I do see that, yes.
Could Mr. Temponi please first bring up the first of those two reports? Sorry. So that's Court Book Document 19, and this, oops, I'm sorry, Mr. Gilmore, can I tell you that this is the report dated the 17th of December 2018. Do you recognise it?
Thank you, yes.
All right. And then just for completeness, well, could we firstly go in this report to Court Book page 0394. And could I ask you please, Mr. Gilmore, to read to yourself paragraphs 3.1 through to 3.6. Or indeed 3.8, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And then could we go to Mr. Thomas's second report, which is Court Book 20.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And could we go to Court Book 20? This is the second report that you referred to, Mr. Gilmore. Do you recognise it?
Yes.
And could we go to section 2.1.1 on page 0407? And could you read 2.1.1 and 2.1.2?
Thank you.
And then also please read 2.1.3, just the question. And then could Mr. Temponi please take us to page 0409, and Mr. Gilmore, could you read the third paragraph on that page starting as detailed?
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Gilmore, if Mr. Temponi could please take us back to Court Book 19 and section 3, paragraphs 3.1 and 3.2. Mr. Gilmore, can I ask you please, what is it in those two sentences that tells you that Mr. Thomas had demonstrated a sound process?
That he'd located himself in the area where the investigation had occurred.
Right.
So he was, as we covered earlier, I suppose, digging up the same area.
Well, can you tell me where he talks about in 3.1 or 3.2 digging?
No.
The only
Sorry,
information,
yes, that same area.
the only information that you have in 3.1 and 3.2 is to the effect that Mr. Thomas went to an area of origin that had been identified by the TFS.
Yes.
Now I put it to you again, what is it about that that satisfies you that Mr. Thomas followed any kind of sound process for the purpose of identifying the area of origin himself?
That he'd put himself in the same place.
Right, so your basis for concluding that Mr. Thomas demonstrated a sound process for determining the area of origin is that he went to an area of origin that had been described for him by the TFS.
Yes.
And so sound process, as far as you're concerned, involves something like following a map. Is that right?
If you're trying to be in the same place as that person was.
Right. Okay. And then in relation to Mr. Thomas's efforts to identify the the point of origin or the cause of the fire, could you please tell me what it is in paragraph 3.6 to 3.8 of this report that satisfies you that Mr. Thomas followed any kind of sound process?
Firstly, the tools that he'd taken with him show the state of mind he was in with the trowel and paintbrush, and his description of an archaeological dig in accentuations to expose the root structure.
Mm-hmm. When did you first become aware that Mr. Thomas had excavated the area that was shown in his photographs, Mr. Gilmore?
It was during our initial trip to Tasmania in 2018.
Was it
established earlier.
Was it before or after you did your excavation?
I think it was after.
Right. And I think you said to His Honour this morning that you were a little surprised when you found out that Mr. Thomas had already dug in the area.
Yes.
Can you tell His Honour, do you recall now how you found out that Mr. Thomas had dug in the area?
I think there were a series of photos.
Well, did somebody give you a series of photos?
Yes.
Who?
It may have been Mr. Reed, it may have been Mr. Knight.
Right. Okay.
I'm not sure. I think it was at that before we flew out meeting, right. I think.
And when you became aware after your excavation that Mr. Thomas had done a fairly large excavation of the area near the tree stump some 4 years before you had done, did you become concerned at all that perhaps the area that you were excavating might have been so compromised that in fact there was no useful information to be got from it?
No, I was looking for that burning in that top part, which I found in that spiky stump.
Right, so you were looking for burning in the spiky stump and you think that you excavated an area different from the area Mr. Thomas had excavated, is that right?
Yes, as we covered earlier, that little depth bit was different, yes.
Okay. And given your understanding, Mr. Gilmore, of the possibility that a smouldering burn in tree roots that had gone on for a few days would have reduced or may have reduced the roots to little more than ash powder, did you have any concerns as to whether an archaeological dig after the period when the TFS had already undertaken their excavation was unlikely to find the remnants of the charcoal line that the TFS had been able to identify when they were the first ones on the scene?
In my mind, the last photo shows charcoal still in the wall of the excavation, and so that's what I was searching for.
Right. You're referring to the photographs that show a couple of pieces of charcoal sitting on the white shovel.
There is above that there is a rock with, I think, charcoal in the wall underneath it.
All right. Well, just to be fair to you, could we go please to document 24 and photograph 32? Is that the photograph you're referring to, Mr. Gilmore?
Yes.
Now, you can see some pieces of charcoal on the white arrow and some on the shovel.
Yes.
Are you able confidently to identify any solid pebbles of charcoal still in the face of the wall that's been excavated?
No, just the blackened area underneath that rock there.
Right, and you can't tell whether that's solid charcoal or just ash powder that's discoloured the soil, can you?
No, it's, no.
And to be clear, Mr. Gilmore, so far as you recall, the area that the TFS had excavated was not an area that either you or Mr. Crowe excavated?
I think the mystery hole, the fourth one, was an attempt to dig up the area in front of this arrow, but through subsequent, I don't know if I got to the 500 millimetres depth.
No. Well, in fact, you do know that you didn't get to the 500 millimetres depth, don't you?
Yes, I don't know if I got to the depth of where the charcoal was, which was estimated, I think, at 500.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so would it be fair to say, Mr. Gilmore, that having not dug in the area where the TFS dug, or to the depth that the TFS dug, you did not find a line of charcoal consistent with the charcoal line that the TFS reported?
Yeah, that's fair enough to say. Yes.
Thank you. Now, just lastly, in relation to Mr. Thomas, Mr. Gilmore, and his report, which you say follows a sound process. Did you have any discussions with Mr. Thomas about what evidence he might have collected during the course of his investigations in 2013 and 2014?
Not that I recall. That's
Right.
yeah.
You said before, I think, that you were provided with some photos showing Mr. Thomas's excavations.
Yes.
Did you ask him whether he kept any notes to record what work he'd done?
No, I didn't ask him that.
Right. Can I ask Mr. Temponi, please, to bring up court book? In fact, before we go to that, Mr. Reid asked you some questions either this morning or yesterday, Mr. Thomas, about the purpose of keeping notes. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do. Yes.
And would it be fair to say that you regard keeping notes as an important aspect of a fire scene investigator's role?
Yes.
And the purpose of the notes is to ensure that there's a record of observations that's not then able to become obscured by the passage of time and the failings of human memory.
It's primarily for the investigator.
Yep.
Yes.
And keeping notes is an important complement to also taking photos, isn't it?
Yes.
Because photos don't tell you everything, do they?
No, they're telling more and more all the time, but no, you're correct.
Yep. And among other things, photographs, for instance, we've already established don't give you any information about depth or perception. Now, could Mr. Temponi please bring up Court Book 199? Oops.
Sorry, Your Honour, please don't recognise me.
Okay, no problem. We might come back to that, Mr. Gilmore. Would you agree, Mr. Gilmore, that it's important for a fire investigator after attending a scene to make notes and ideally prepare their report as soon as possible after the attendance while memories are still fresh?
Yes.
Well, thank you. Now, Would you regard it as sound procedure, Mr. Gilmore, for a fire scene investigator to take no notes and then take some 4.5 years between the date of site attendance and preparation of the report as reflecting sound procedure?
No.
On document number 199 appears on my version of the court book.
Well,
Just be worth another look.
Mr. Temponi's flogging can wait until the end of court, Your Honour. And I should say, for his grandmother's
I'm
benefit,
using
I
Mr.
didn't mean that.
Temponi's version of the court book, so I can't understand what's not there.
Thanks very much.
My associate has updated mine, but somebody else has not updated Mr. Temponi's.
Perhaps Mr. Ioannidis might provide the USB, which I'm told does have document 199 on it.
It's all right, I'll leave it here. I just thought I'd let you know.
Say for the benefit of the transcript that, in fact, for the benefit of Mr. Temponi's grandmother, that the reference to flogging was entirely in jest. It's little more than a mild beating.
So I think Mr. Temponi has got the record for the number of words used in the transcript.
Number of references, Your Honour?
Yes. By a country mile.
Perfect, thank you. Now could we scan out, please, so that Mr. Gilmore can see the whole of the page. Now I asked you a question a moment ago, Mr. Gilmore, based on an assumption that a fire scene investigator took no notes during the course of an investigation and then took 4.5 years to prepare a report. Now, can I ask you next, Mr. Gilmore, if what you see on the screen here was the sum total of the notes that the investigator had taken and then took 4.5 years to prepare their report, would you regard that as sound procedure?
No.
Thank you. Now, would you regard it as adequate, Mr. Gilmore, for such an investigator then to base their recollection of the investigation and their report entirely on the information that they were able to recall from photographs that had been taken?
Particularly just qualifying that if it was written at the end of the 4-year period or whether that's when the report
Yes.
was produced in the end. Yes. So no, if it's a 4-year period.
All right, thank you.
Unaware of drafts and those sorts of things that were done.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gilmore. Now, next, could Mr. Temponi please take us to the exhibits that were marked as MG1. I think this is what I referred to as the chickenpox photograph. That's the one. Thank you. Now, I asked you some questions this morning, Mr. Gilmore, about the old notion of an area of confusion compared to an area of origin.
Yes.
Now, it is the case, isn't it, that in the very early stages of a fire, the very small flames are likely to be burning firstly at a low intensity.
Yes.
And likely to be moving in different directions according to their proximity to little spots of fuel.
Yes.
And in rocky, broken terrain, like the kind of terrain indicated in this photograph, even relatively small stones will cause irregularities in the air. There will be a lee side of each stone. There'll be a side of the stone that's exposed to the prevailing wind.
Yes.
And the little eddies of air that flow around and over the stones will affect fire behaviour. And that's why, for instance, we see in this photograph signs of low intensity fire moving really in a number of different directions.
The problem is that they don't move away.
Right. Well,
It's wavering 180 degrees. If it's something that you can observe in the early stages, the number of indicators going the wrong way is what's leading to draw this photograph like it is.
okay, and can I just understand something you just said, Mr. Gilmore? You said that they don't move away from the area of origin?
You would expect the indicators to show fire moving away from the area of origin is what I was intending to say.
But in broken ground, undulating with rocks across it of the kind that we see in this photograph, again, the fire is likely to use a word that we've seen already today, it'll speckle across the area. It'll move in a fairly random way according to the tiny little eddies of air that are disrupted by the stones that the wind is blowing across.
Yes, but generally moving away.
Generally moving away, and more likely than not, very soon generally moving in the direction they're being pushed by the wind.
Yes,
Right.
particularly in the grass context.
Yep. And as I understood your evidence to my learned friend in relation to this photograph, if we broke this photograph down into 4 squares, 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom left-hand quadrant indicates fire moving up from the bottom left-hand corner of the photo.
Mm-hmm.
The right-hand side of the photograph from about marker 20 pointing down to the letters MG1, fire was moving in the direction from marker 20 down to MG1?
No. No, where marker 20 is, that first circle to the right of marker 20, or that includes a bit of marker 20, the fire is coming from the right-hand side margin of the photo.
Right.
The double circle shows the stick burnt on this end, and then there's some considerable fuel to the right of it. The next marker 20, to the bottom left of marker 20, sorry, is approaching from underneath, and then the one further down that's sort of flat on the bottom and rounded, the lowest of the red circles on the right-hand side, the fire is moving from left to slightly upper right.
Right, okay. Now you referred to the stick that's indicated by the conjoined circle, the double circle.
Yes.
And you said that there's a patch of heavier fuel to the right of it. I take it you're
Yes.
referring to the grey
Yeah, where that
sand?
the whitish ash is sitting there. Yeah.
Now, Mr. Gilmore, great respect, are you able to tell with any confidence whether what you see there is ash indicating that there'd been a concentration of fuel in that location, or that it's just some of the sandy topsoil that might have had some ash blow over it? It's really not possible to tell, is it?
It appears to have some depth and relief to me in the photo.
Right, so
If you look at the far side, you can sort of see objects sitting up, like small stones and dirt and things.
when you say the far side, do you mean
Of the white thing that you're referring to, if you look to the
white-
top side of that.
So the white streak from the stick across to the right-hand margin of the photograph,
Yes,
the area of pebbles, perhaps,
yes,
that's above it as we look at the photograph, you say that you can tell that that's sitting proud of the surrounding soil, is it?
Yes, it seems to be.
Okay, but again, even if those pebbles are sitting proud of the surrounding soil or dirt, the grey streak there could equally just be a patch of effectively grey topsoil or sand on which there had been no fuel. That's one plausible explanation, isn't it?
I don't think it's sandy there.
Okay, well,
I think the sand is further down to the east.
well, if we look up to the to marker 20 and up towards the top right-hand side of the photograph, that top
Yes.
right-hand corner, all of those bone-coloured patches there, do you say that they're signs of heavier fuels that have burned, or are they
Yes,
just
I think
soil?
so.
Okay. Could we perhaps, just for the sake of comparison, go back to Mr. Thomas's report, which is document 19, Mr. Temponi, and can we go to, for instance, photograph 18, the last one in the report. Mr. Gilmore, these are more photos from Mr. Thomas's excavation, and would you agree with me that there are signs here that there's a range of different soil colours in the topsoil in the area that was around this tree stump in 2013?
Yes.
Right. And so, having refreshed your memory by reference to that photograph and then thinking about the photo I showed you a moment ago, do you agree with me that the pale patch that I asked you to look at to the right of the stick might be a sign of a concentration of fuel that's been incinerated, but it might equally be a sign, simply just a patch of effectively sandy soil on which nothing ever burned?
No, I'm still of the opinion that it's burnt material. It's speckledy of many different colours, the white, and in fact there's even some small black, like micro bits of charcoal there that are in amongst it. So
Right. You say that's charcoal, do you, Mr.
I think so, by what I'm looking at, yes.
Right, okay. You really can't tell from the photograph, can you?
No, it's an opinion, so yes.
Oh, well, it's actually just your best guess.
Well, it's my opinion, yes.
Well, I'm afraid I need to test that a little bit, Mr. Gilmore. You can't tell whether that's charcoal, can you?
I can't tell, no.
No. And in circumstances where you can't tell with any certainty that it's charcoal, there's unburned material immediately adjacent to that pale patch. You agree with me, it's equally plausible that the dark material sitting on the pale patch is not charcoal, it just happens to be vegetable debris or pebbles or something else, but not charcoal.
It's possible,
charcoal.
yes.
Now, Mr. Gilmore, when one takes into account the different... Sorry, I withdraw that. Firstly, I think you've agreed with me that what this photograph shows is at least some indicia of very low intensity fire moving in a number of different directions.
Yes.
Secondly, you would agree with me that this photograph shows actually quite a lot of extremely fine combustible material that in fact has not combusted.
Yes.
When you take those factors into account and consider the potential of the rocks and perhaps any indentations in the ground surface into account, then really the only conclusion that can be drawn from this photograph is that there was a very low intensity fire that was moving erratically and in a somewhat random pattern across different but fairly confined locations within the area shown in this photograph.
It does show different directions, yes.
And this kind of phenomenon that you see here is the kind of thing that, in your view at least once upon a time, would have been described as an area of confusion.
It could be, yes.
Well, it would be, wouldn't it?
Well, what I'm thinking is in the area of origin there are many areas like this. So.
Right. Okay. Well, sorry, to be clear, I did suggest to you that this would be an area of confusion, not necessarily that it was the only one.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
I see the time, Your Honour. Oh, sorry. Is it 4 o'clock or 3:45? I'm sorry, Your Honour. I'd forgotten.
4 o'clock. We had to adjourn a little early yesterday.
That's right. Thank you, Your Honour. I'm sorry about that. I'm very happy to keep going. Now, Mr. Gilmore, we discussed this morning the phenomenon of smouldering burns in root systems emanating from relatively mature trees, and you referred to the investigations that you'd undertaken in Victoria between 1998 and 2000. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
And I think you agreed with me that a tree that had reached the level of maturity indicated by the old stump that we're concerned with in this proceeding is likely to have had hundreds, if not thousands, of roots emanating from it in probably all directions.
Yeah, if you count the fibrous roots, that's a fair enough statement, yes.
Right. So I take it you've heard Mr. Jackson's evidence that there's different types of roots. There's fibrous roots, there's wood roots, there's filamentous roots. You understand all of that?
Yeah, not the filamentous to that level.
Right.
My understanding of root systems is practical more than being able to categorise, yes.
And it's your understanding, I think you've already confirmed, that the roots will sit at different levels under the surface of the soil.
Yes.
Now, His Honour's heard evidence, and I'm sure you're aware of it, Mr. Gilmore, that Mr. Butler, when he was at the site in the afternoon of the 3rd of January 2013, observed a still burning, in the sense of smouldering burn, piece of root on the north side of the tree stump and up against the old stump. Are you aware of that evidence?
Yes, I'm aware of that, yes.
And having regard to that report, Mr. Gilmore, you would think it entirely plausible, I take it, that there could have been more than one root that had been affected by the smouldering burn?
Yes.
And it's possible that the area of origin that was identified by the TFS might not have been the only area of origin in the general area to the north of the tree stump. There's an area of confusion, and it's very hard to be precise as to exactly the very specific point where the fire first became a flame in sufficient fuel to propagate into a wildfire.
Yes, we couldn't identify a point, yes.
Now, can we go back please to your second report?
Just before you do, Mr. Armstrong, Mr. Gilmore, how are you aware of Mr. Butler having said that?
I think it's from reading a transcript.
A transcript of this trial?
Yes, or it may have been, I've watched a little bit of the YouTube stuff, but not all of it. It was one or the other. I think it may have been transcript.
Thank you.
Now, in your second report, that is the 2020 report, Mr. Gilmore, could Mr. Temponi please take us to Court Book page 0277? And firstly, Mr. Gilmore, could you read paragraph 187 beneath the photograph?
Yes.
Now, that paragraph is referring to the area that we've just been discussing next to marker 20, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And as I'm just asking you to help me out here, frankly, because you seem to be saying in paragraph 187 that that area indicated by marker 20 had, prior to the fire, been the site of another stump which was burned in the fire and proceeded to burn out both above and below the ground in the 71 hours between roughly 2 p.m. on 3rd of January and sometime, well, the time when the TFS excavated. Is that right?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
Now, Mr. Gilmore, in that hypothesis, I take it that your assessment, or at least hypothesis, is that this stump that had burned out had been a fairly significant piece of wood to warrant the description of a stump?
I think it appears there's dotted around, well, inside that photo, for instance, dotted around in there are stumps that would be 200 millimetres across, probably, and probably about the same height. Several of them are around that area. And the depression at cone 20 was substantial.
Right.
And so that's what led me to wonder about how much wood had burnt at that site.
Okay, so can we go back to the previous screenshot, Mr. Temponi, the chickenpox photo? Now, I take it, Mr. Gilmore, that you're interpreting that photo to indicate that the area in which there's the stone with the X on it is a depression of some significant depth. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. And again, that's just your assessment, doing the best you can from a two-dimensional image.
Yes, that's correct, using
Right.
shadows, etc. Yes.
And your hypothesis is that prior to the fire there was a 200 millimetre diameter stump protruding from the ground in that location, and it then burned as a result of the fire over the ensuing 71 hours.
I think so, yes. The size may be different, but yes.
Right. Now, firstly, Mr. Gilmore, if there had been a stump, a piece of wood in that location experiencing the kind of combustion that your hypothesis assumes, then that combustion is extremely likely to have also consumed all of the fine fuel that we still see on the ground around this depression, isn't it?
Depending where it was.
Well,
So
we
it
know
is-
where it was, Mr. Gilmore. It was
Yeah.
on the X, wasn't it? You just said that.
There's fine fuel remaining if we look to the bottom right of the depression.
Yes.
The rest of the area shows deep burning over a long time is what I see.
Right. Okay. And so your hypothesis is that this tree stump was ignited by the fire that ultimately became the Fawcett bushfire. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Okay. And then I take it, Mr. Gilmore, that you would expect such a piece of wood to have taken a few hours to burn?
I would think so, yes.
Right. And it would follow, wouldn't it, Mr. Gilmore, that this hypothesis of a burning stump of wood in this location near marker 20 that needed to burn for at least a few hours before it was completely incinerated must have meant that that burning stump was burning through the middle of the afternoon and into the evening, at least of the 3rd of January 2013.
It depends on its height and how it burnt. So if it was higher, it would take longer to burn. The fact that it's circled by rocks makes some difference as to it continuing to burn as smouldering fire, but there would have been flaming fire for a start, yes.
Right. Now, again, just to be clear, Mr. Gilmore, it's still the case that on your hypothesis, this stump was continuing to burn either as a free burning, flaming piece of wood or as a at least vigorously smouldering piece of wood right through the afternoon of the 3rd of January 2013, correct?
I would think so, yes.
And I put it to you, Mr. Gilmore, that such a burning piece of wood would have been extremely obvious to anybody walking around this area during that afternoon, correct?
If they were conducting mop-up, I would expect it, yes.
Right. And so if there had been a burning stump of the kind that you speculate about, you would have expected somebody like Mr. Butler, when he was looking at the tree stump with Ms. Barrett, to have noticed this burning or smouldering stump at the location of marker 20.
I would think so, yes.
I have to say, Mr. Gilmore, you're the first person ever to suggest that there was still a stump burning in the ground near marker 20 during the afternoon of the 3rd of January 2013. Your hypothesis is a little incredible, isn't it?
I don't think so, sir, no.
That might be a convenient time.
If you please, Your Honour.
All right, thanks. I'll adjourn until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
All stand, please. This honourable court now stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.